Hey, Pipsqueaks.
Hey, Pipsqueaks.
Ooh, look how gray we look because the sky. We look like zombies. We are on our way. You probably can tell from the title. We are going to our city's most famous haunted spots on a ghost tour.
Ghost tour! I'm getting something.
She's almost there. Ooh. If you know what that is,
Put in the comments.
Comment down it below. Well, you messed me up, so I can say whatever I want. They're dressed up in old colonial clothes. I think they're just taking us to the haunted buildings. They're not going in them. They're just telling us the stories, and because some of the buildings are used now for offices and things like that, so we can't just walk in. But I'm not exactly sure how this is gonna go, so we're gonna find out together. All I know is it's gonna be spooky. Happy Halloween.
I don't know.
Grade as there have been sightings. Now, parapsychologists tell us that a haunting can happen if there's been a terrible tragedy or sorrow in a family. Somehow the spirits are not able to cross over. They're caught between dimensions or timelines, and they're just not able to get free of where they experience the tragedy. Some of these tragedies could be suicide, fires, or even murders. So as we continue around Pensacola, I'll explain some of the stories along with the houses that we'll be stopping at. The first story is about the building directly across the street. Years ago, this was the Spanish Museum, and now it's the Museum of Industry. But several years ago, we had an employee that told us about this. She worked for the village for about 35 years. And when she was a new employee, her offices were located in that building. She would come into work in the morning, and that was a problem because she couldn't get into her office. It was always locked. And even though she would take the lock open, it was still locked in the morning. So she finally resolved that. And then as she grew more comfortable with her job, she would work late at night. She would hear footsteps pacing back and forth on the concrete walkway outside her office. She'd go and look to see who was there. No one. There was no one in the building. In the museum, there were some issues. It seems like around 6:30 in the evening, there would be cold, mysterious spots in the front part of the museum. We can only wonder what might have happened in that building at 6:30 at night.
My dad's here, that you all know and love. Drunk. Say hi. Say hi.
What's that Area 51 sign in there?
Say hi.
Hey, everybody.
Ooh.
Say hi. Say hi. Say hi. Hi. Beverly said, stay close when there's a car coming.
Do not hit us. Teach you they're fighting.
Beverly. Whoa, that was weird. I thought I just saw someone on that front porch.
The house I want to tell you about is the one right here. Now it's an attorney's office, and we moved in about 2000, the year 2000. But the house itself was built in 1900. And before that, there was a house there owned by a cobbler that was built in 1850. Well, this house has had several strange occurrences. In years gone by, this was the scene of some seances. people back in the early 1900s were obsessed with talking with the dead. And they would hold seances and have these people visit. And they often had guides who would be conduits for the spirits or even automatic writers. They would kind of go into a trance and write what the spirits were telling them to say. So several of these were held at this house. They'll hear footsteps in another room and there's nobody else in the offices. Occasionally they'll hear what sounds like a silverware tray that is dropped to the floor and they can hear every piece of cutlery hit the floor. So we can only wonder if some of those spirits that visited this house during a seance are still in that house.
Why is this doing this?
Just get on the road.
Mother.
Do you believe this chick?
She sounds pretty legit. Gotta be honest. She's dead on.
Three of these little priests or rectors passed away. Two of them died from yellow fever and one died from consumption. And they were buried out behind the church. Well, over the years, the church was expanded and they actually built over the gravesite. About 45 years ago, an archaeological dig was conducted to see if there really were three graves underneath the church. And they did indeed find three complete skeletons. So they had new caskets constructed, laid the bones out in correct anatomical order. Skeletons were laid out in the coffin, in the caskets, waiting for reburial. The house was locked up. The next morning they came in and found that all the bones had been rearranged. They had a funeral procession. It was very solemn. It was led by the current rector of the church. They walked right down this sidewalk where you're standing. And there was quite a parade of people that came down. And one of the men that worked on the student who worked on the archaeological dig, he thought he knew everybody that was in the group, and he saw three men walking in the midst of the procession. And they had on long robes. They had scarves around their necks. One was carrying a prayer book, and he was very solemn. And the other two were kind of laughing and talking as they walked along. He glanced away, and when he glanced back, they were gone. Later, he asked some people if they had seen these three. Who were these three people? And they said they didn't see them. But the current rector described how these people, when they were buried, they were always buried with long robes, a stole around their neck. They usually had a Bible or a prayer book in their hands, and they were always buried barefoot, which these three gentlemen had been. Then the carpenter who built the new caskets, he said that these same three men had appeared to him when he was building the casket as if to give their blessing over the proceedings.
That was a cool story. I like that story.
That's very creepy.
This is the Barclay house. She built this house after her second husband died of yellow fever. Sometimes they see a shadow out of the corner of their eye, and when they turn to look, there's no one there. Clara lived here for about 20 years, and she moved out in the early 1890s, and this was rented as a school. And then Clara herself passed away in 1898. People that reported to us, one was a psychic. She had visited this house, and then she visited the Barclay house, and at the Barclay house there's a picture of this house. And she told the tour guide there that she would never go back to this house. And when she was asked why, she said the whole time she was on in the house and on the ground, she kept hearing a voice saying, "I was murdered and nobody knows. I was murdered." Now there's no history of anybody in the Dorr family that came to an unfortunate end, and we don't know about whether it could have been someone that attended the school or not. It's just a mystery as to what that voice is referring to. But next door at the Kennedy house, there are several ghosts that are in hauntings that appear here. There is a very cruel man and his beautiful wife who was murdered. One of the ladies that worked in this house has been a place of business, and many of these houses, you know, they're businesses and they've also been homes and kind of back and forth. One of the ladies that worked here said that she often saw shadows and no one was there. There was a heavy gilt mirror over the fireplace, and she would go through the room and the mirror would be perfectly straight, and the next time she went through the room it would be tilted. Sometimes furniture was moved and sometimes the entire room was rearranged. Several years ago, a lady had an antique shop here, and she and her son ran the antique shop. They closed up for the night and they went upstairs, and they heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs after them. Well, they locked the door and they went to an inner room and locked that door, piled furniture against the door, and the footsteps kept coming. Well, the lady had a gun, and when that doorknob started to turn, she shot 3 times through the door. She just knew she couldn't have missed anybody that was there behind the door. She and her son cowered in the corner all night long until daylight, and she could run out and call the police and have them come and investigate. There was no blood, there was no body, no signs of forced entry, but there were those 3 bullet holes in the door. So they called in a psychic medium to come in and kind of analyze and investigate what could have happened at this house. And here's what she discovered. Years before, an old, maybe not an older man, a very cruel man was married to a very young and beautiful woman. And he was very jealous of her. So when he went to work every day, he locked her in her room so that she couldn't get out. Well, she discovered a way to get out of the room. And one day he came home early and found her not in her room. They had a big argument. Somehow, during the argument, she slipped and fell down the stairs and was killed. Ever since then, she has a spirit or a vision of a woman has been seen not only in the house, but sometimes across the street in the park. She wears a long dress and has beautiful long blonde hair. Now, she's not really a scary ghost. Whenever she appears or is felt upstairs, she tries to keep people, it's like she tries to warn them to stay away from the staircase and stay away from the upstairs room. A reporter visited the house one day and was touring the house, and she heard a voice say, "You had better leave." And she kind of hesitated, and the voice said, "You had better leave now." And she did. Now remember, I told you sometimes these stories are continuing. It was a tour group just like this one a few years ago, and the house was for sale, so it was empty. And the tour guide thought that would be a cool thing to go up on the porch and tell these stories, and it would sound even more real. So she started to go through that gate right there, and as she opened the gate, she heard a man's voice say, "Don't you bring those people on my porch." She looked around. No one else had heard that voice. She backed out and moved her tour group away. Later, she asked to be taken off this tour. She is absolutely convinced that someone or something in this house does not like her.
So this is the residence. People are living here. I'd be scared. If you hear this tour, I'd be doing black shadows, walking past windows.
Have all the lights off.
Or, imagine if you live here and you didn't hear these stories and someone's out front saying, yeah, and they murdered 37 people, and you're like, what? What happened in my house?
Why didn't they tell me this? What's the realtor doing?
How are they living there for real though? They know that multiple people get killed all the time.
What is it? This is what?
In the early 1800s, yellow fever was a horrible disease that afflicted Pensacolians. They thought it could be evil gases coming out of the swamps, perhaps eating green or unripe fruit, or even intemperance. Now today we know that it was a mosquito that causes yellow fever. Then the person would go into a delirium, and about 5 days later, after their skin and eyes had turned yellow, they would die. It was just terrible. And unfortunately, at the time, the family that lived in this house, their names were Ricci. He owned a couple of grocery stores in town, and he lost his wife and 2 children to yellow fever. And he was just so heartbroken, so distraught, that when they were buried up in St. Michael's Cemetery, he would go up there at night and sleep on their graves. If you can imagine, early in the morning, someone's passing by St. Michael's Cemetery on the way to work, and they see someone in the cemetery stand up. I think they would be quite startled. And as I understand it, quite often merchandise has been thrown off the shelves. It's littered on the floor the next morning. So apparently, whether it's the Ricci family or not, there are some spirits at work in this house.
Oh,
Who wants to live in there? I see him. Oh, did you hear that? Did you hear that?
An acorn, but
what?
it was just an acorn.
Out of what tree? The pine tree? I was joking. I said, there he is. And they went, what? Stop. And then something went up there on the porch. It was him. That's a lot of room for a ghost to haunt.
About the restaurant. It seems that there's a chef that comes in quite early every morning to start doing his prep work and his baking. And one morning he was in there and the only lights were on in the kitchen. And he heard a noise out in the dining room. And he ignored it at first, but he kept hearing this noise. And finally he went to look and he didn't see anything, and he looked over the counter and he saw these little child's hands, and he kept looking, and there was a little boy about 8 or 10 years old. And as he looked at it, the child was dead. He was so scared, he called up the owner at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, I do not want to work somewhere where there's no.
While the tour is on, we're here trying to chase an iguana. Beverly is gonna kick our butts. Oh, she's already telling the story.
Some new neighbors one time saw her in the house and in the ground and called the owners because they were afraid she was a trespasser. Now, one of the managers of the restaurant put her desk right under one of those windows on the left-hand side here, and she noticed that whenever she would sit at her desk, it felt like somebody would bump it, or the desk would shake. And one of Bessie's nieces came in one day and said, oh, you put your desk right where Bessie had her chair. She used to like to sit there and look out on the street. So the owner moved the desk, and she never had any problems with the desk being moved again. Remember a few houses ago I told you about the McIntyres who conducted seances? This is where they lived. And they had Mr. McIntyre, he was a spirit writer. He would go into a trance and just write whatever came into his mind. He documented very well all of the visitors that came to this house. And so we do have written records of those seances. In the early 1800s, there was a little boy that lived here in this house with his mother. His bedroom was in the back, and he could overlook the waterfront if he'd like to watch what was going on at the fort and what was going on down by the water. Well, his mother forbid him from going out to play with his friends one day. And in a fit of rage, he ran out of the house, ran down the street, turned in Florida Blanca, where we're going to be going in a minute, and ran all the way out to the water and jumped in to have a swim. Unfortunately, there'd been a heavy rainstorm, and at that point where he jumped in is where one of the exit points of one of the streams was. There was quite a current with the runoff, and he was pulled under and drowned. They brought his body back to his heartbroken mother the next morning. And ever since then, the child has been walking up and down Government Street. Many of the residents that live here have seen him. He's, as I said, I guess about 8 or 10 years old, thick, dark hair, and he just wants to find his mother so badly. They called in a psychic medium to see if she could kind of calm the spirit and kind of make it so that he was at peace. She felt that there was such tragedy connected with this house that she couldn't even go in the door. She said it was just so heartbroken. Now, I was given this story, telling this occurrence a few years ago, and the lawyer that owns this business came out, and she said, she listened for a couple of minutes, and she said, everything she's telling you is true. We've seen the boy several times.
Oh, look
Everyone look for a little boy. Aw. That's a creepy house. I don't like that house. That looks like Monster House. Sydney and I went in the car to a spirit box. Remember the guy? He ran into my car with his bike. Remember that?
Yeah.
That video, we were trying to talk to that little boy.
Ew.
Because I saw it on the internet before. I've never done one of these tours before. Whoa!
And unfortunately, he was lost at sea. For years, his wife has been watching for him to come back. Several years ago, the house was empty, and some teenagers broke in to see what they could see inside. And as they explored the house, they started up the stairs, and at the top of the stairs was a lady all dressed in white, and she said, "Come here!" They did not. They ran out of that house as fast as they could. Now this house, back in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, it was the scene of a mysterious blue light that showed during the night. The house was inhabited by the last two of the Axelson family, two spinster cousins, and when one of them died in 1940, the blue light began to shine, and it was in the bottom floor window overlooking the water. Well, you know, in 1941, 42, and thereafter, people in Pensacola had to have blackout shades on their windows so no light during World War II, so no light would be apparent. And the houses were all blacked out, but that blue light continued to shine. And they were afraid, the government was afraid it might be espionage, and they had people spying on it and trying to see if there was some kind of a code or some kind of nefarious plot that was going on. They never could figure it out. So after a few weeks, they just kind of gave up on it. And that blue light continued to shine until the late 1950s. I worked with a lady who was a teenager. She attended Tate High School, and she said the thing to do, especially on Halloween night, was to come down here and see the blue light. Ruth's mother was on her way to the bathroom, and a gentleman in a straw hat walked in front of her, shut the door, and she waited, and she waited, and she waited. Pretty soon she got tired of waiting, so she knocked on the door. The door swung open by itself, and there was nobody in that room. Now, her Aunt Lizzie also lived in the house, in one of the rooms, and her son Henry had died in the room. Lizzie came home one day, and she tried to get into her room. She had a key. She could not unlock the door, and she beat on the door and beat on the door. And finally she said, "Henry, you let me in this blankety-blank room." And the door swung open. She just felt that Henry was playing a trick on her. Dancers in elaborate Victorian dress have been seen dancing through the trees to unearthly music, and then they just sort of dance and disappear.
What is that place, man?
Look how perfect that is.
Look at those candles.
Whoa, they look like they're floating.
Hanging from the trees and stuff.
I like everyone's style around here. I love that front porch. Do you see all of them?
See all the skeletons?
But this is a story about a child seeing a child ghost. The lady that ran, not the most recent one, but one of the ladies that had a shop here. One Saturday she came to work and she brought her little 6-year-old daughter with her. And the little girl was sitting in the back room at her mother's desk. And she turned around and looked, and there sat a little boy. And she said, "Mother, there's a boy here." And he disappeared. She later described him as having on knee breeches, long stockings, funny shoes, and he wore a vest and a hat. Now that little 6-year-old didn't know it, but she was exactly describing the clothing of a little boy in the 1800s.
Wow.
Later in the year, around Christmas time, there was always a display that the owner would put near the front entrance to entertain children, and she had like a snow scene with artificial snow and little houses and toys and so forth. And the children would play with the snow and kind of get it all over the floor. So every night before she closed up, she'd clean it up and put everything back in order. Many mornings, she came in to find that it was all disturbed again, as if a young child had been playing with the toys there in the front of the shop.
Brandon, you gotta get your horse done.
Okay, this is the story of Mariah Baker. Mariah was a cook and a nanny for the Harris. And she moved with them from Texas and cared for the children in the house between 1906 and 1904. All those years, she was like a member of the family, but she would never eat with the family. She always preferred to eat by herself in the kitchen. He'd hear dishes clinking and the sounds of cooking going on. After the renovations were finished, this kind of calmed down. They felt like Mariah was still a part of their family and a part of this home. All the people that have ever lived in this house, as most of the places, they have been homes and now it's a place of business. But they all have stories to tell. There's faucets would turn off and on, doors that were locked would open by themselves, lights would flash off and on, sometimes the TV would start up all by itself. And once, when a family was listening to music, the empty rocking chair rocked in time to the music. Well, one of the ladies that lived here got really curious about what was going on, so she took her child's Ouija board and asked, "Who are you?" And the Ouija board spelled out several times, Thomas Maristo. His years of life were from 1718 to about 1831. He was Army corporal and later became a sea captain, and he came to Pensacola, purchased this house, and awaited his fiancée who was coming on another ship. Unfortunately, the ship sunk and she was drowned and she never arrived. But Thomas stays at this house and continues to wait for her to come. At one time, part of the house burned and it was rebuilt. It stays in the older part of the house. One of the residents kind of talked to him and promised that as long as he never frightened her children, he could have the run of the house. But if she ever got kind of tired of having a ghost in residence and said, "Thomas, you've got to go," or if someone came into the house and said, "I don't believe in ghosts," he would be enraged and he would rip things off the wall, rearrange furniture, and sometimes he would appear. And when he appears, he's about 5'4", 5'5". He has dark hair, dark eyes, has a high neck shirt with a cravat, and there's always an odor of kind of a medicinal ointment odor about him when he appears. The people that work here always leave the window shades up because Thomas likes to look out. And sometimes he can be seen. As I understand it, last week, one of the tour's participants took a picture and got him in the window. I've never seen him, but several of the tour guides have. So that's why if they did not leave the shades up, if it was curtains were closed, they'd be on the floor the next morning, and shades would be turned back up. There is a closet in the front stairs, under the front stairs, and when people would go in there, often the door would slam behind them. And there was a real cold air in that closet. Her grandparents owned this house many years ago. And she and her sister were playing the record players. We used to have wind-up record players. They didn't have electricity, And they were playing the wind-up record player, and they were playing it over and over and over and over. And I think she said it was Buffalo Gals, Will You Come Out Tonight, over and over. They finally got tired of it, and they put the record player away, went into another room, and the record player began to play again. She said she was so scared she ended up under the bed. So you see, these stories do continue. I thank you very much for your attention and your participation. I hope you've enjoyed another slant on Pensacola history.
Thank you.